It all began on a cold, foggy morning at Heathrow Airport. The air smelled faintly of coffee, jet fuel, and rain-soaked tarmac, a perfect welcome to England. Two friends had just landed after a long, sleepless flight from New York. Their journey was supposed to be simple, 7 days across England, just to see what all the fuss was about. But what awaited them was far beyond sightseeing. It would be an unforgettable story of adventure, laughter, and a little chaos. They looked around the airport, half awake, trying to adjust to the local time. The announcements echoed through the terminal, a mix of British politeness and robotic precision. Mind your belongings. Welcome to London Heathrow. One of them, a tall guy with messy brown hair and a camera slung around his neck, turned to his friend and said, "I can't believe we actually made it." His friend grinned, stretching his arms. 7 days, man. Let's make it count. They collected their luggage and walked toward the underground station, pulling their suitcases over the smooth tiles. The plan was to stay in London for the first 2 days, then travel north Oxford, the Cotswolds, maybe even Manchester if time allowed. They had no strict schedule, only curiosity and a small notebook full of random ideas. Their hotel was in Westminster, not far from the River Thames. The ride there took almost an hour. The train windows showed the city slowly unfolding, brick buildings, double-decker buses, small corner cafes, and crowds of people walking briskly under umbrellas. It was raining lightly, of course, London's signature weather. By the time they checked into the hotel, the jet lag had started to kick in. The room was small but cozy, with a window overlooking a narrow street filled with old-fashioned lamps. They threw their bags onto the bed and stood silently for a few moments, soaking it in. This was England, old, elegant, mysterious. But instead of resting, they decided to go out right away. "We can't waste our first day sleeping," one of them said, grabbing his jacket. "Let's walk. See what happens." Their first stop was the River Thames. They crossed Westminster Bridge, and the sight of Big Ben rising through the mist stopped them both in their tracks. The clock tower looked almost unreal, the gold accents glinting faintly in the gray sky. The rhythmic ticking echoing faintly in the wind. Street performers played violins near the bridge. Tourists posed for photos, and a man in a bowler hat sold roasted chestnuts from a cart. The air smelled of roasted sugar and rain. They walked along the riverbank toward the London Eye. The Ferris wheel loomed massive and slow-moving, its glass pods glinting faintly. "Should we?" one of them asked, gesturing to the ticket booth. The other laughed. "We came this far. Let's go up." The view from the top was breathtaking. London stretched endlessly from the towers of Canary Wharf in the distance to the historic dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. The Thames looked like a silver ribbon winding through the heart of the city. For a moment, both friends fell silent. There's something humbling about seeing a whole city at once. The noise fades. You feel like part of something much bigger. When they came down, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. They ducked into a small cafe near the south bank. The walls were lined with old books and photographs. And the air smelled like espresso and cinnamon. They ordered 2 flat whites and shared a slice of Victoria sponge cake. The waitress, with a warm London accent, asked, "First time in England, lads?" "Yeah," one of them said. "Just arrived this morning." "Ah, you'll love it. Just remember, we talk about the weather a lot, and we queue for everything." She laughed and walked away, leaving them smiling. After the coffee, they wandered aimlessly through the rainy streets. They ended up near Trafalgar Square, where a group of protesters waved flags and chanted slogans about climate change. The sound of drums echoed between the stone buildings, mixing with the honks of taxis and the chatter of tourists. It was chaotic, but alive, a city with a pulse. By evening, their feet were sore, but their spirits were high. They found a traditional pub, tucked in a side alley, with a wooden sign that read "The King's Arms." Inside was dimly lit and smelled faintly of beer and old wood. Locals sat at the bar, laughing and shouting over the hum of conversation. They ordered fish and chips with a pint of ale. The food arrived steaming hot, the fish golden and crisp, the fries thick and salty. "This is heaven," one of them said, with his mouth full. "England in a plate," the other replied, raising his glass. They clinked their pints together. The night grew colder outside. When they stepped out, the rain had stopped, and the streets glistened under the lamplight. They took a long walk back toward Westminster, passing red phone booths and black cabs, their reflections shimmering in puddles. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone player performed under a streetlight, notes floating softly through the air. As they crossed the bridge again, Big Ben struck 10. The deep chime rolled across the river, and both friends stopped to listen. It felt timeless, like the whole city paused for that single sound. Back at the hotel, exhaustion finally hit. They threw themselves on the bed, shoes still on, and laughed quietly. The day had been long and beautiful. One of them whispered, half asleep, "Tomorrow we'll go to Notting Hill. Maybe the markets." The other murmured, "And then to Oxford. Let's see the old colleges, maybe rent bikes." The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Cars passing, distant sirens. A late-night bus groaning down the street. London, they thought, wasn't just a place. It was a rhythm. It's an endless story, written in rain and light. The next morning came early. The sunlight filtered weakly through gray clouds, and the city was already awake. The sounds of clinking dishes from downstairs, people talking in the hallway, the aroma of toast and tea drifting up. They packed their small backpacks and headed out again, this time to explore deeper. The tube station was crowded, full of people in suits, holding newspapers, and commuters staring at their phones. The friends stood slightly apart, looking at the colorful map on the wall. "Notting Hill Gate," one of them asked. The other nodded, and they jumped onto the next train as the doors closed. The familiar recorded voice said, "Mind the gap between the train and the platform." It was their first full day in London, and yet it already felt oddly familiar, like they belonged there. Just two small figures lost in the great heartbeat of the city. The train rumbled through tunnels, and soon they emerged above ground. Notting Hill greeted them with pastel-colored houses, flower stalls, and antique shops. The Portobello Road Market was alive, vendors shouting, the smell of fresh bread and street food everywhere. One of them bought a small vintage compass from an old man selling collectibles. The vendor smiled knowingly. "Every traveler needs one of those," he said. "Just don't let it tell you where to go. Let it remind you that you're already on the way." They laughed and walked on, unaware that this small compass would later become part of a story neither of them could have predicted. That evening, as the sky turned golden, they sat on a bench near Hyde Park, watching the ducks glide across the Serpentine. The city buzzed softly around them. The first day in England was ending, but it was only the beginning of something extraordinary. They didn't know it yet, but the coming days would test their friendship, their courage, and the way they saw the world. And as the sun disappeared behind the London skyline, one of them said quietly, "I feel like this place is trying to tell us something." The other smiled. "Maybe it is." The first night faded into silence, carrying the promise of 6 more days and countless untold stories waiting to unfold. Scene 2. The morning began with a faint hum of city life echoing outside the hotel window. The friends woke up late. The jet lag hadn't quite left them yet. The sky outside was pale and heavy with clouds, a silvery tone that made everything look washed and soft. From their window, they could see London buses rumbling past and people walking briskly with umbrellas. Even though it wasn't raining yet, they packed their bags again, this time lighter, just essentials for the next few days. The plan was simple: take a train from Paddington Station to Oxford. But before leaving the city, they wanted one last walk through central London. The streets around Westminster were still waking up. Cafes were just opening, and the smell of freshly baked croissants drifted into the air. They stopped at a small bakery tucked between two tall buildings. Its sign reading the Flower and Clock. Inside, the owner, an older woman with gray curls and a cheerful voice, greeted them warmly. "Morning, loves. Tea or coffee to start the day?" They ordered 2 cups of English breakfast tea and warm scones with clotted cream and jam. The woman smiled knowingly. The proper way to start an English adventure. They chatted with her as they ate. She told them she lived in London all her life, never once tired of it. "This city changes every day," she said, "but the people, they're what make it special. You meet everyone here, poets, bankers, dreamers, and ghosts." When they asked about ghosts, she laughed. "Oh, you'll see. England's full of them. Every street has a story." They left the cafe, smiling, carrying the faint warmth of her words as they made their way toward Paddington Station. The station was busy, full of travelers hurrying between platforms. The great glass roof let in soft daylight, and pigeons fluttered among the beams. They bought 2 tickets to Oxford and found seats by the window on the Great Western Railway. As the train pulled out of London, the city began to fade, the skyline giving way to stretches of countryside. Fields rolled past, dotted with sheep, small villages, and patches of forest still damp from the night's rain. One of them leaned his head against the glass, mesmerized. "It's so quiet," he said softly. The other nodded. "It feels like we've stepped into another century." The journey took just under an hour, but it felt timeless. When they arrived at Oxford Station, the first thing they noticed was the crisp air cooler, fresher, with the faint scent of wet grass and stone. The city had an old-world charm, with cobblestone streets, arched gateways, capped college buildings covered in ivy. They walked slowly, their luggage rolling behind them, absorbing the rhythm of the place. Students rode past on bicycles, bells ringing. The sound of church bells echoed faintly in the distance. It felt like a storybook come alive. Their first stop was the Bodleian Library. Standing before its grand, ancient facade, they felt small. The carvings, the worn stones, the sense of time, it was overwhelming. A tour guide passing by overheard them and smiled. "First time in Oxford?" he asked. "Yeah," one of them replied. "It's incredible." The guide nodded. "There's history in every step here. These halls have seen kings, scholars, and dreamers. Be sure to see the Divinity School. It's like walking into a cathedral of knowledge." They thanked him and spent hours exploring, wandering through narrow alleys, old quads, and hidden gardens. The air was filled with the faint scent of old paper and rain. Inside the library, the silence was almost sacred. Rows upon rows of ancient books stretched upward, their spines faded with age. One of them whispered, "Can you imagine how many stories live here?" By afternoon, they stopped for lunch at a pub called the Eagle and Child, famous for once hosting writers like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. The wood-paneled walls were covered with photographs, and the atmosphere felt warm and timeless. They found a corner table and ordered steak pies with mashed potatoes. While waiting for the food, they overheard 2 older men at the next table discussing local folklore. One of them mentioned the Whispering Bridge, an old stone bridge just outside Oxford, said to be haunted by a voice that speaks to travelers at night. The friends exchanged amused glances. "Should we check it out?" one of them whispered. "Of course. What's a trip without a ghost story?" After lunch, they rented bicycles and rode along the countryside road that led away from the city. The sun had come out now, turning the fields golden. They passed small cottages with flower gardens and cows grazing lazily. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth. It took them about 30 minutes to reach the bridge. It wasn't grand or eerie at first glance, just an old stone bridge over a quiet stream surrounded by willow trees. Birds chirped softly, From the water reflected the sky like glass. They parked their bikes and leaned over the railing, listening to the gentle rush of water. "Doesn't seem very haunted," one of them said. "Maybe it only whispers at night," the other replied, grinning as they prepared to leave. Something caught their eye, a small envelope wedged between two stones near the edge of the bridge. It was damp but sealed, with a faded wax stamp on it. Curiosity took over. They gently pulled it out and wiped away the moisture. On the front, written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting, were the words, "For the traveler who listens." For a moment, neither spoke. Then one of them whispered, "Is this a prank? Maybe from the locals." "Maybe, but it feels kind of real, doesn't it?" They didn't open it right away. Instead, they sat on the bridge for a while, just listening, the sound of the water, the distant birds, the whisper of wind through the trees. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, they decided to open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting was beautiful, looping and deliberate. It read, "If you have found this letter, it means you've heard the silence that most forget to hear. Follow the path where the river bends twice, and when you see the tree that leans toward the water, listen again. Some stories are waiting to be found." The words sent a strange shiver down their spines. It wasn't fear, more like curiosity mixed with wonder. They looked at each other. "Do we follow it?" "Of course we do." They got back on their bikes and followed the river path, laughing, half joking about treasure hunts and secret societies. The path curved twice, just like the letter said. And sure enough, there was a leaning tree by the water, an old oak that seemed to stretch toward the stream. They stopped there, standing quietly. The evening light turned everything golden. For a long time, there was nothing, only the rustle of leaves. And then, faintly, they heard something, a whisper, barely audible, carried by the breeze. It wasn't words, just a sound, soft and strange, like a sigh. They froze. The wind shifted again, and it was gone. Neither spoke. One finally said, trying to sound casual, "Probably the wind through the branches." "Yeah," the other replied. "Probably." But deep down, both of them knew it felt different, too deliberate, too perfect to be just the wind. They stayed by the river until the sun disappeared behind the hills. Then, as twilight fell, they rode back toward the city, their laughter echoing faintly through the fading light. The letter was tucked safely inside one of their backpacks, its mystery lingering like a promise. Back in Oxford, the streets glowed softly under the lamplight. Students passed by on bicycles. Music drifted from open pub doors, and the smell of rain returned as the clouds rolled in again. That night, lying in their small inn, they couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Who had written it? How long had it been there? And what did it mean to hear the silence? As sleep began to take them, one whispered, "Maybe England's ghosts aren't meant to scare us. Maybe they just want to be remembered." The other smiled in the dark. "Then let's remember them all." Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft and steady, like a lullaby written by the land itself. Tomorrow, they would leave Oxford for the countryside of the Cotswolds, but neither of them knew that the letter they found would follow them and that their journey was only beginning to turn from travel into destiny. The morning mist rolled lazily over the countryside as the two friends packed their bags once again. Oxford was still half asleep. The streets were quiet, except for the distant ringing of church bells. They left the inn just after sunrise, their breath visible in the cool air, and walked toward the small car rental near the station. Today, they were heading to the Cotswolds, a place they'd seen only in photographs. All honey-colored cottages, rolling hills, and winding lanes that seemed to belong to another time. Inside the car, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee from the takeaway cups they'd picked up along the way. The GPS voice guided them out of Oxford and onto narrow country roads lined with hedgerows and stone walls. The drive took them deeper into the heart of England. Past fields glistening with dew and clusters of cottages that looked like they'd been painted into existence for miles. They drove in silence, not awkward, but thoughtful. One of them pulled the small, yellowed letter from his jacket pocket and unfolded it again. The paper was fragile now, but the words still seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light. Greater than follow the path where the river bends twice. He traced the words with his finger. You know, he said softly, I keep thinking this isn't random. Someone meant for us to find it. The other friend kept his eyes on the road. Maybe, but it could also be someone's idea of poetry. People leave weird notes in strange places all the time, okay? But that handwriting is like from another century. They both fell quiet again as the landscape shifted into open meadows and rolling hills. The world here felt slower, older. Even the air had a kind of stillness that was different from the buzz of London or the academic calm of Oxford. After about 2 hours, they arrived at a small village called Burt in the Water, often called the Venice of the Cotswolds. The place was breathtaking. Stone cottages reflected in the clear, shallow river that ran through the center of town. Ducks floated lazily near the bridges, and flowers spilled from hanging baskets along the streets. They parked near a bakery and stepped out into the crisp air. The smell of bread and butter drifted from an open window. A local man in a tweed cap stood nearby, feeding crumbs to the ducks. When he noticed the two travelers, he smiled politely. First time in Burton, I reckon? He asked in a thick Gloucestershire accent. Yeah, one of them replied. It's beautiful here. The man nodded proudly. It's quieter than the city, that's for sure. Folks come here for peace, not excitement. He hesitated, then added, but if you're the sort who likes old tales, we've plenty of those too. The friends exchanged a quick look. What kind of tales? Oh, old village ones. Ghosts by the river, lovers lost in the mist. There's even talk of a letter that appears for travelers. Something about a whispering spirit that made both of them freeze. A letter? One asked, trying to sound casual. The man shrugged. Could just be superstition. But my gran used to say, if you find a letter near running water, it's a message from someone who never left. The air suddenly felt heavier. The two friends thanked the man and walked away, trying to process what they'd just heard. The coincidence was too close. They found a small inn beside the river, called the Willow Rest. The building looked centuries old, wooden beams, ivy creeping along the walls, a stone chimney with smoke drifting lazily upward. Inside, the innkeeper, a kind, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Hollins, greeted them warmly. Welcome, travelers. You're lucky. We've got one room left, overlooking the river. Most folks book months ahead this time of year. They accepted gratefully, and as she handed them the old brass key, she paused and said, You've come for the festival tomorrow, haven't you? Festival. She smiled. Ah, you didn't know. Tomorrow's the Midsummer River Fair. Locals gather by the water, light lanterns, tell stories. It's one of the oldest traditions here. You should stay another day. It's magic, truly. They exchanged glances again. Maybe we will, one said. The room was small but beautiful. A wooden desk, floral curtains, a window overlooking the river that glowed in the afternoon sun. They unpacked, sat by the window for a while, and watched the people outside. Everything about the village felt unreal. It's like stepping into a painting. Later that evening, they wandered through the narrow lanes, taking photos, talking softly about how surreal it all felt. They stopped by a small bookstore tucked between two cottages. Inside, the scent of old paper filled the air. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thin glasses, looked up from behind the counter. Evening, lads. Looking for anything in particular? Just browsing, one of them said. Actually, do you have any local history books? The man's eyes twinkled. Ah, the curious kind. Follow me. He led them to a back shelf filled with old volumes, folklore, village legends, handwritten journals. One of the books Its cover, faded and torn, caught their attention. It was titled The Letters of the Lost River. They opened it carefully. Inside were stories of travelers finding mysterious letters along the waterways of the Cotswolds. Letters that seemed to guide them to hidden places or deliver forgotten messages. Some ended in miracles, others in tragedy. One passage read, "Those who find the letter of the river are chosen by silence itself." The writer is never seen, but the message always finds the listener who hears more than sound. The words made their skin prickle. They looked at each other. This can't just be coincidence. They bought the book and hurried back to the inn as the sun dipped below the hills. The golden light turned the village into something out of a dream. They ate dinner downstairs, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and ale, then returned to their room, the old book between them on the desk. As night fell, the sound of the river outside became louder, like it was breathing. They opened the window and leaned out, feeling the cool air against their faces. One of them whispered, "What if this isn't just a story? What if we were meant to find that letter?" The other smiled faintly. "Then maybe tomorrow at the festival, we'll find out why." Before sleeping, they left the letter and the book side by side on the desk. The candlelight flickered gently, casting shadows that danced across the room. Sometime in the middle of the night, one of them woke up suddenly. There was a sound, faint but distinct, like paper rustling. He sat up and saw the letter lying open, even though they had left it sealed in the book earlier. The wax seal, which had been broken, was now strangely intact again, as if untouched. He stared at it, frozen. Then he heard it, that same soft whisper they'd heard by the river in Oxford. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, like the air itself was speaking. He reached out to wake his friend, but before he could, the whisper faded, replaced by the steady murmur of the river outside. When morning came, the letter was gone. They searched the entire room, every drawer, every corner. Nothing. Only the faint imprint of the letter remained on the surface of the desk, like it had been pressed there for years. Neither spoke much over breakfast. The innkeeper noticed their quietness and asked if everything was all right. They nodded politely, but when she turned away, one of them said softly, "Maybe the letter found someone else last night." That afternoon, as the festival began, the village filled with people carrying lanterns. Music drifted through the air, fiddles, laughter, the gentle hum of life. But both friends felt something deeper beneath it all, like the air itself carried a secret. They stood by the river as dusk settled, watching the lanterns float away one by one, their reflections shimmering in the water. For a brief moment, one of them thought he saw a figure, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, standing across the riverbank, watching them. But when he blinked, she was gone. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His friend was already staring at the same spot. The river whispered again, and this time they didn't run. They just listened, and the silence, once again, seemed to speak. The morning after the Midsummer River Fair was quiet, wrapped in a light fog that hung over the village like a memory that refused to fade. The friends woke to the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Outside their window, the river moved slowly, rippling beneath the soft gray light. The floating lanterns from last night were gone, carried away downstream, but one or two still lingered near the bank, flickering weakly like dying fireflies. Neither of them had slept much. The disappearance of the letter, the whisper in the dark, and the strange figure they had both seen across the river. None of it felt like a dream, though it should have. The entire village seemed different that morning, still beautiful, but heavier, like something ancient was stirring beneath the calm surface. Downstairs, the inn's small breakfast room was nearly empty. Mrs. Hollins greeted them with her usual warmth, but when she saw their tired faces, her smile faltered. "Did you boys sleep well?" They hesitated. One of them finally said, "Mostly, yes. Just strange dreams. She gave them a long, knowing look. Ah, the river does that sometimes. The river. She poured tea for them both, her hand steady, but her eyes distant. Locals say the river remembers things, stories, emotions, even people. When you listen closely, you might hear echoes of what is carried away. Most folks dismiss it as superstition, but I've seen too much to laugh at it. They exchanged uneasy glances. One of them asked, "Has anyone else ever found letters by the river?" Her hands paused midair. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, "Yes, once. Many years ago. A couple came through tourists, like you. They found a letter near the Willow Bend, just outside the village. They said it told them to follow the sound that hides in silence. The next morning, they were gone, left without checking out. Their car was still parked outside. No one ever found them." The room seemed to grow colder. She sighed softly. But stories like that have a way of growing taller with time. Maybe they just left quietly, still. Her voice trailed off, and she turned away to refill the teapot. After breakfast, the friends stepped outside. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the glistening green of the fields beyond the village. The air felt electric, charged with quiet mystery. "I can't stop thinking about what she said," one murmured. "The river remembers." Maybe that's what the letter meant. Listening to silence isn't about ghosts. It's about memory. The other nodded. "Let's go back to the river bend," she mentioned. The Willow Bend. They followed a narrow dirt path that led beyond the last of the cottages, past a small meadow filled with wildflowers. The river curved sharply there, forming a gentle arc where willow trees leaned over the water, their branches swaying like curtains in the breeze. For a while, they just stood there, listening. The sound of the current was soothing, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Then one of them noticed something glinting beneath the surface, a fragment of glass, perhaps metal. He knelt by the bank and reached in, pulling out a small locket on a thin, rusted chain. It was cold to the touch, covered in silt. When he opened it, there was a faded photograph inside, a young woman, probably from the early 1900s, smiling faintly at the camera. "She looks like..." He paused, then shook his head. "She looks like the woman we saw last night." They both stared at the picture in silence. The back of the locket had an engraving, barely legible, "E.L. Always by the water." Suddenly, a faint sound echoed nearby, like a soft humming or the murmur of a voice carried by wind. They turned quickly, but no one was there. The trees swayed gently, leaves rustling in unison. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, it sounded like someone singing." The voice came again, faint but clear this time, drifting from somewhere upstream. Without speaking, they followed it along the riverbank. The sound grew louder, though it was hard to tell if it was human or something else entirely. It had a rhythm, a kind of melody that didn't belong to any song they knew. After about 10 minutes, they came to a small stone bridge. It wasn't on any map they'd seen, and it looked much older than the others. The stones covered in moss, the arch slightly crumbling. On one of the stones, carved faintly into the surface, was an inscription, "Greater than where the river remembers, so do we." The whisper returned, soft, almost intimate. This time it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, barely above a breath. "Greater than please. Finish what I began." The words were so faint they almost doubted hearing them. But both of them looked at each other and knew neither had imagined it. One of them whispered, "Finish what?" The other stepped closer to the bridge and noticed something carved deeper into the underside of the stone, almost hidden by moss. He brushed it away carefully. It was a small symbol, a circle with 2 curved lines through it, like ripples in water. "It's the same symbol from the wax seal on the letter," he said quietly. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the sound of water rushing beneath their feet. Then one of them said, "We need to find out who E.L. was." Back in the village, They returned to the old bookstore. The shopkeeper looked up in surprise when they entered again so soon. Back already. Couldn't get enough of our legends. They placed the locket on the counter. Do you recognize this? The man leaned forward, squinting through his glasses. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he murmured, "Good Lord. Where did you find this?" "By the river bend, near the willows." The shopkeeper swallowed hard. "That belonged to Eleanor Langford. She lived here over 100 years ago, drowned in the river on Midsummer's Night, 1906. They said she was waiting for someone who never came back. Her spirit said to linger by the water, the woman who whispers." The air in the shop felt heavy again, thick with the weight of old sorrow. He continued, "They say she wrote letters to her lover, a sailor who never returned. When she died, the letters vanished. Some say the river took them. In every few decades, travelers find them again." The friends stood frozen. "So the letter we found could have been hers," the man finished softly. "If you've still got it, you should." "We don't," one interrupted. "It disappeared last night." The man's face went pale. "Then, perhaps, she has it again." That evening, as dusk fell, they returned to the river one last time. The village was quiet now. The fair was over, and the lanterns were gone. The water reflected the fading light like molten silver. They stood on the same bridge where they'd first heard her voice. The locket hung from one of their fingers, swinging gently. "I think she wanted this to go back," one whispered. He stepped closer to the edge and opened his hand. The locket fell into the water with barely a splash, disappearing into the current. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a breeze swept across the surface of the river, and they both heard it, a whisper, softer than before, but unmistakably grateful, greater than thank you. The wind stilled. The water calmed, and for the first time in days, the silence felt peaceful. They stayed there until darkness settled completely, watching the stars appear one by one. The river glimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, quiet now, as if the story it carried had finally found its ending. When they walked back toward the village, one of them said softly, "Maybe the letter wasn't meant for us to solve anything. Maybe it was just meant to be found so she could be remembered again." The other nodded. "Then we did what we were supposed to." That night, they slept deeply for the first time since arriving in England. And when they woke the next morning, the air felt lighter, the world clearer. The fog had lifted completely, and sunlight bathed the village in gold. Before leaving, Mrs. Holland handed them a small brown envelope. "Someone left this for you by the door early this morning," she said with a puzzled smile. They opened it slowly. Inside was a single blank sheet of paper, except for one small line written at the bottom, in the same elegant handwriting they now knew by heart. "Greater than every traveler leaves a story behind. Thank you for hearing mine." They looked at each other and smiled. No words were needed. They got into their car, rolled down the windows, and drove out of the village. The road stretched ahead through green fields and sunlight, the river winding beside them for a while before disappearing into the horizon. Neither of them looked back, but somewhere behind them, near the willow bend, the water rippled just once, as if waving goodbye. The road out of the Cotswolds curved through endless stretches of countryside, glowing beneath the soft gold of late morning. For the first time in days, the air inside the car was filled with quiet laughter and easy silence, the kind of silence that feels like peace, not mystery. The locket, the letter, and the whispers of the river now belonged to another world. One they had entered and somehow helped set right, but life, as always, kept moving. Their next destination was Manchester, a city that couldn't have been more different from the sleepy beauty of the English countryside. It was loud, vibrant, and alive, the heartbeat of the North. Music, culture, and history collided in every street. And for two friends who'd just spent days chasing ghosts. The idea of noise and crowds felt almost comforting. They arrived in the late afternoon. The skyline rose ahead, a mix of old industrial brick and sleek modern glass. The streets pulsed with people heading home from work, street performers playing guitars near cafe corners, and the occasional roar of a tram passing by. Their hotel was near the northern quarter, an area famous for its murals, music bars, and vintage shops. The walls of the buildings were covered in colorful art, faces, poems, shapes, all painted by local artists. It felt like every wall had something to say. Every alleyway whispered a different rhythm. After checking in, they went for a walk. The city smelled like coffee, rain, and something electric, the scent of energy itself. One of them stopped by a record shop with a sign that read Vinyl Revival. Atia, the owner, a man in his 40s wearing a leather jacket and a contagious grin, greeted them as they stepped in, looking for something specific. He asked, his accent pure Manchester. "Just browsing," one said. "Heard this is the place for good music." "You've heard right," the man said proudly. "Manchester built music. Oasis, Joy Division, The Smiths, New Order. It's in our blood." Spent nearly an hour flipping through records, the sound of soft jazz playing in the background. When one of them picked up a vinyl copy of the Stone Roses, the owner smiled. "Good choice. That one's got soul. You know, this city's music isn't just sound, it's rebellion, hope, heartbreak. We don't just play it, we live it." They left with the record tucked under one arm, though neither owned a player to use it. It felt symbolic, a piece of the city's pulse to carry with them. As night fell, the city transformed. Lights reflected off wet streets after a brief rain shower, and laughter spilled from every pub door. They found a small venue called the Ruby Room, where a local band was playing live. Inside, it was warm and crowded, filled with people swaying to the rhythm, their voices blending with the music. The lead singer, a young woman with a powerful voice, sang a song that felt raw and personal about leaving home, chasing something you can't name, and the silence that follows when you finally find it. The lyrics hit both of them deeply. "Funny," one whispered. "It almost feels like she's singing about our trip." The other smiled faintly. "Maybe everyone's got their own letter from the river. They just call it something else." They stayed until closing time, talking with locals, trading stories over pints. A man in his 60s told them how he'd seen the city change from factories to art galleries, from smoke to light. "Manchester's a phoenix," he said. "We burn, but we always come back louder." Okay. When they finally stepped out into the cold night air, the streets were slick and shimmering under the street lamps. The rain had returned, soft and steady. They walked without direction, letting the city lead them. The sound of distant music floated from somewhere. Maybe another band, another story unfolding. At a crossroads, they stopped. The rain glistened on their faces. One of them said quietly, "You know, this whole trip, it's been more than travel. It's like every place had something to tell us. London taught us wonder. Oxford gave us mystery. The Cotswolds gave us peace. And now, Manchester gives us rhythm." The other finished. They both laughed, standing there under the neon lights, rain-soaked and content. The next morning, they visited the Manchester Art Gallery. Inside, they found a small exhibition called Echoes of the Riverlands. It was a collection of paintings inspired by English folklore, water spirits, forgotten letters, lost travelers. One painting made them stop in their tracks. It showed a woman by a river, dressed in white, her hand resting on an old stone bridge. The artist's name, written at the bottom, was Eleanor L., dated 1905. Their breath caught. It couldn't be, and yet it was there, undeniable. The style was hauntingly beautiful. The same serenity they'd felt by the river, captured in every brushstroke. Underneath the painting, a small plaque read, "The Whispering Bridge, painted by Eleanor Langford, shortly before her disappearance," said to depict the place where she waited for someone who never returned. They stood there for a long time, neither speaking. The past and present seemed to blur, as if the painting itself was watching them. Grateful, when they finally left the gallery, the air outside felt clearer, brighter. The city buzzed around them, but for once, they didn't feel like outsiders anymore. They were part of the rhythm, the constant hum of life that connected everything: cities, rivers, people, time. That evening, they took a tram to the outskirts of Manchester, where the city met the countryside again. The sunset stretched wide and orange across the horizon. They found a hill overlooking the city and sat there in silence, watching the lights come on one by one. After a while, one said softly, "You think we'll ever come back here?" The other smiled. "Maybe, but even if we don't, I think a part of us already stays." They looked out at the glowing city below. The faint echo of distant music carried on the wind, mixing with the whisper of the breeze. And though the river was far away now, its memory was still with them, gentle, patient, eternal. When they finally got up to leave, one of them reached into his jacket pocket. He frowned slightly, then smiled. There, resting at the bottom, was a folded scrap of paper he didn't remember putting there. He unfolded it slowly. There were no words this time, only a small symbol, a circle with 2 ripples running through it, the same mark from the wax seal. They looked at each other and laughed softly, not out of fear, but understanding. Some stories don't end. They just change places. The letter, the river, the song, the city, they were all part of the same story, passed from one traveler to the next, whispered across time as the last light faded. They started walking back toward the tram station, their footsteps echoing softly against the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, faint, almost invisible beneath the noise of the city, the whisper came again, not from a ghost, but from the world itself, greater than keep listening. Morning sunlight spilled through the half-drawn curtains of their Manchester hotel room. The rain had finally stopped, and the air outside was crisp and golden, the kind of morning that feels like a clean page. Their 7-day trip was nearing its end, though neither of them wanted to admit it. There was still one last destination waiting for them, London again. The city where it all began. The train ride back was quiet. The hum of the carriage, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the track, it all felt hypnotic. One of them stared out the window, watching the landscape roll by. Stone walls, grazing sheep, towns waking to Sunday calm. The other sat back, headphones in, lost in thought, perhaps listening to the same local band from the Ruby Room on his phone. Hours passed. The countryside began to fade into suburbs, and then the familiar sprawl of London began to take shape. Endless rooftops, winding streets, that unmistakable pulse. When the train finally pulled into Euston Station, they both took a deep breath. It was like stepping back into a dream they hadn't quite finished. They had decided to spend their last day revisiting a few places they'd missed before. The first stop was Camden Market, a maze of colors, sounds, and smells. Vendors shouted, music played, the air thick with the scent of spices and street food. They wandered through the stalls, picking up small trinkets, a carved pendant, an old brass compass, a postcard of the Thames at sunset. At one stall, run by an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, they noticed something unusual: a stack of antique photographs, faded and curling at the edges. They began flipping through them absently until one of them froze. It was a photograph of a young woman standing beside a river, holding a parasol. Her face was turned slightly away, but something about her was unmistakable. "Excuse me?" one asked the vendor. "Where did these photos come from?" The woman shrugged. "Old estate clearance. Somewhere in Oxfordshire, I think." "Why?" He hesitated. "Just looks familiar." The vendor smiled knowingly. "Funny thing about old photos, they tend to find the people they're meant for." He didn't buy the picture, but he couldn't stop thinking about it as they walked away. It was as if the past kept brushing against the edges of their story. never quite letting go. Later, they made their way to the south bank. The Thames shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, dotted with boats. Tourists crowded the walkways. Couples strolled hand in hand. Buskers played violins and painted faces. The city felt alive, humming with energy, a living heartbeat of millions of stories layered over centuries. They stopped near the Millennium Bridge and leaned on the railing, watching the water flow beneath them. For a moment, neither spoke. "You ever think about how we end up in places like this?" One finally said. "Like, what if every step we take is already written somewhere?" The other chuckled softly. "After Oxford, I wouldn't doubt it. But maybe it's not written. Maybe it's whispered. We just have to listen close enough to hear it." A gust of wind brushed past them, and for just a heartbeat, they both swore they heard it. That faint, familiar whisper again. It was almost playful this time, like a farewell rather than a haunting. They smiled, not at each other, but at the river itself, as if acknowledging an old friend as evening drew near. They decided to end their journey at a quiet spot, a little riverside pub in Greenwich, known to locals as the Wanderer's Rest. It wasn't fancy, just wood tables, soft lights, and a view of the water. The walls were lined with maps, travel notes, and photos from patrons all over the world. They took a table by the window. The setting sun cast long shadows over the river, turning the water to gold. Inside, the low murmur of conversation mingled with the clink of glasses and the smell of roasted food. A waitress approached, young, with auburn hair and a locket around her neck that caught the light just so. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange, gentle familiarity. "What can I get you?" she asked with a small smile. They ordered 2 pints and some food, but as she walked away, one of them couldn't stop staring. Something about her felt connected, not in appearance, but in presence, like she was part of the same story they'd stumbled into when she returned. Setting down their drinks, she noticed their curious look and laughed softly. "You two aren't from around here, are you?" "No," one replied. "We've been traveling a week around England." "Nice," she said. "This city can be strange when you first arrive. Feels like it hides things in plain sight." "Yeah," he said. "We've noticed." The 3 of them talked for a while about travel, about how people always come to London searching for something they can't quite name. Before she left, she said something that froze them both in place. "You know," she said with a hint of mischief, "my grandmother used to tell me stories about travelers like you, okay? People who go searching and end up finding more than they expected. She used to say, the river always remembers the ones who listen." When she walked away, the 2 friends sat there in silence, both processing what she'd said. Neither wanted to ask the question out loud, but both were thinking the same thing. Could she be connected to Eleanor? As night settled, they finished their drinks and stepped outside. The moon hung over the Thames, silver and solemn. The city lights danced on the water's surface. They walked slowly along the riverbank, letting the cool air wash over them. One of them reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper with the symbol, the circle, with 2 ripples. He looked at it, then at the river, and smiled. Without a word, he let the paper go. The wind caught it, carrying it over the water, and it landed gently on the surface before drifting away. Just like the letter from Oxford. They stood there, watching it float downstream until it disappeared beneath the bridge. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The story had come full circle, from London to Oxford, through the Cotswolds and Manchester, and back to the river that had started it all. And somewhere, deep beneath that dark water, maybe the whisper smiled too. Later, as they walked back toward the city lights, one of them said softly, "You think anyone would believe this if we told them?" The other laughed quietly. "Probably not. But that's the beauty of it. Some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be lived." They turned a corner, disappearing into the hum of the London night. 2 friends who had come searching for adventure and had found something far, more profound. And though the city would forget their faces, it would remember their footsteps. The river would carry their laughter, their silence, their story, folding it into its endless song. Because some journeys never really end. They just keep echoing through time, waiting for the next two souls to listen. As the clock struck midnight, the wind picked up once more, carrying a whisper along the Thames, soft as memory, light as truth, greater than well done, travelers. You've heard the river's heart, and then only the sound of London remained, eternal, alive, and endlessly whispering. Epilogue. Months had passed since their journey through England. The 7 days that had felt like both a dream and a lifetime. The world had moved on, as it always does. Autumn had given way to winter. The first flakes of snow drifted lazily across the city streets. One of the friends had returned to his quiet life, the same apartment, the same morning routine, the same view from his window. But something inside him had changed. The trip had left a mark, not loud or visible, but deep, like the faint echo of a song you can't quite forget. Every now and then, he would catch himself thinking about it. The whispering river, the hidden letter, the woman in the painting, the record shop in Manchester, the waitress with the locket. All of it felt like a story written somewhere beyond time, one that had chosen them for a brief moment. Then, one cold morning, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address, no stamp markings except one, a faded emblem in wax, pressed with a circle and 2 ripples. He froze. The symbol, the same one from the locket. He brought it inside and sat by the window, staring at it for a long time before finally opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, old but well preserved, smelling faintly of river air and lavender. The letter was written in elegant handwriting, greater than to those who listened. The river remembers. Every soul that walks beside it leaves something behind, a word, a dream, a truth. You came not seeking answers, yet you found them in silence, in laughter, in friendship. Do not think your journey was coincidence. The water called, and you answered. Wherever you go, keep listening. The world speaks softly, and only a few still hear it, until our stories cross again. E.L. He sat there, staring at the signature. E.L. Eleanor Langford. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock. Snow continued to fall outside, covering the streets in white. He looked up, and, for a moment, thought he saw something move past the window. Not a person, not quite, just a shimmer of light, like the reflection of water where there shouldn't have been any. He smiled faintly. "You still watching, aren't you?" he murmured, folding the letter carefully. He slipped it into a small wooden box on his desk, the same box that now held the vinyl record from Manchester, a stone from the Cotswolds, and the old brass compass from Camden Market. Pieces of a journey, reminders of something too big to explain. That evening, he met his friend again at a small cafe overlooking the river. The water moved slowly beneath the bridge, reflecting the orange of street lamps and the soft blue of twilight. When he handed the letter over, his friend read it silently, eyes widening just slightly. Then he looked up and said, "You think it's real?" The other smiled. "Does it matter?" They both laughed quietly, the sound merging with the low hum of the river below. After a while, it fell into silence, not the kind that weighs heavy, but the kind that feels full, alive. The city around him went on, cars passing, footsteps echoing, the world moving forward. Yet, in that small corner of time, it felt like everything had paused. The river whispered softly, as if greeting them again. One of them reached into his pocket and took out a coin, just an ordinary British pound. He looked at it, then flicked it gently into the river. It landed with a small splash, sending ripples outward across the surface. "For luck?" his friend asked. He shook his head, smiling. "For memory." "Kay." They sat there until the lights along the river came on, glowing like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere, faint and distant, came the sound of a song familiar, almost impossible. The same melody that had played that night in Manchester, drifting through the air as if the wind itself remembered when they finally stood to leave. The snow had stopped, and the city seemed quieter than usual. They walked together toward the bridge, side by side, saying nothing. There was no need for words anymore. As they crossed, one turned back for a final glance at the water below. The river shimmered in the streetlight, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw her, the outline of a woman standing by the edge, her figure soft and silver in the moonlight, watching them with a faint smile. Then the wind shifted, and she was gone. They continued walking until the sounds of the city swallowed them again to friends, travelers, dreamers. The road ahead was unknown, but they carried something with them now. Not the mystery, but the peace that comes after understanding. And far below, the river flowed on endless, patient, whispering to the night. Greater than every journey returns to the water. Every heart finds its echo. The city lights flickered. The snow glowed faintly on the rooftops. The world turned quietly toward morning. Their story had ended, but the river's song continued forever.